Hello and welcome to the Accelerated Meran 6b3 chapter about the interesting 8 dxc4. So c4, c6, knight f3, d5, e3, knight f6, knight c3, now the move a6, inviting the Chebanyanko, d4, e6, b3, bishop b4, this very smart move, provoking the bishop to d2, knight b7, bishop d3. And here, in the last chapter, we looked at the solid short castle, the main line, which has been played many, many times, even in a world championship match between Anand and Gelfand, also by myself in recent practice. But in this chapter, I wanted to show you another move. That is the move d takes c4. And this move is incredibly rare. I think, actually, I was the one who introduced it when I played against Paco Vallejo just less than half a year ago, for the first time, in a position that has been played thousands and thousands of times for many, many, many years. And to be honest, it's actually one of the main reasons that why I wanted to recommend Accelerated Meran, because I think this novelty, I mean, it's not like it's going to change the evaluation of the line or anything like that, but it's just to find such a fresh idea in such a known position so early on. I mean, it would be a shame not to recommend it, let's say. So, yeah, the idea, I should admit, is actually not mine. It's an idea from my very good friend Martin Lokander, who is a Swedish IM and has on numerous occasions worked as a second for me. It was his idea. He found it around 1 year ago, but it took me half a year before I got an opportunity to play it, although I was eagerly trying for many games before that. So, yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to be able to show you this, let's say. So first of all, bishop takes c4 doesn't really make any real sense, because as we have mentioned also in the previous chapter, having played b3, it really means that white should take on c4 with the pawn. So, for instance, short castle, and short castle, and now the typical Meran move, b5, bishop e2. Now, there are many ways, but I quite like bishop d6, a little bit similar actually to the previous chapter. And the point is, after e4, we play e5. And actually, we have already transposed to the previous chapter, but one of the lines that was really pleasant for us immediately. Basically, a dream version of the normal Meran. So instead, the obvious move is b takes c4. So far, everything looks normal, but now comes the real point of the previous move, the very surprising move, e5. And, well, the point is, generally speaking, of course, first of all, we should note that it's very rare that we give up the center, especially so early. So that is, I mean, I guess the reason why it has never been played before, so to speak. But yeah, we do have some compensation for that. One of the first things that comes to mind is, of course, that we are threatening to take, followed by e4, winning a piece. So white will lose some time dealing with that. And also, as we saw from the previous chapter, if white ever advances with d5, we are generally speaking doing very, very well, because we have this juicy square on c5 available. So we are putting some pressure. It's not so clear for white how they should react. Actually, Paco Vallejo, who was my opponent when I introduced this whole idea, he thought for a long time, but he is a very experienced player, and finally he came up with the move knight e4. And when we discussed the game afterwards, he said that, yeah, he understood that this was not the best move, or definitely not the critical move, but it looked to him relatively safe, and to go for something sharper without any preparation against an opponent who clearly knows what they are doing, that simply felt too risky for him. And I can quite understand, but it also shows, of course, that it's, I mean, even if it makes sense, it's still sort of a success for our line, that he already was thinking in terms of how to be as solid as possible and how to just equalize. So now I took on d2. It's also what I recommend. Knight takes d2 was played. Short castle. And now there are many ways to play, many ways to get a perfectly solid position, I took on d4, just one of many moves. E takes d4, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and knight f6. And, well, we kept trading pieces. For every trade, the pawn on d4 becomes a little bit weaker. But on the other hand, our pawn on b7, or the pawn on b7 is also slightly weak, so it's too early to talk about a black advantage. Both me and Paco Vallejo felt that black was a little bit more comfortable, but not more than that. And then later on, the computers also confirmed that that opinion. Basically, with some accurate play, white should still equalize, but at least there is no question at all that black is completely fine. So nothing you should be afraid of or worried about at all. The first thing, perhaps, that comes to mind, surely also for Paco in our game, but also for your opponents, is d takes e5. So simply winning a pawn. But now we play knight g4. And it's similar to what we have seen before. We want to pick up the pawn on e5. But here there are some interesting options, actually. Because when I saw the position the first time, I was sure that the most logical, or the move that really springs to mind, is to play the move e6, which is a very typical idea in such situations, to ruin the pawn structure and go for some sort of strategic edge. But now comes a real surprise, also for me when I saw it for the first time. So we shouldn't recapture on e6. Instead, you should play the surprising move knight to c5. And that's very odd, because you're giving up the pawn on f7 with check. But as we will see, things are not that simple. First of all, for let's say just to have it mentioned, the move bishop f5 is still possible, and after bishop takes e6, the pawn is recaptured, and the position after bishop takes e6, knight takes e6 is just equal. The square on c5 is still very, very nice for a bishop or a knight. But as usual, this pawn on b7 is slightly weak, and white doesn't really have any big disadvantages. So only with the square on c5 is not enough to give us an advantage in itself. So this is just, it's quite equal. Of course, the more interesting move is e takes f7 check, king takes f7, and here the bishop on d3 is hanging. White really needs to think carefully about where to move it. The most natural move that comes to mind, of course, is to move bishop to c2. But then we play queen f6, and it turns out that it's very hard to save the knight on c3, because the tactical reason being, if the knight moves, then we take on d2, and all the recaptures has a drawback. Of course, the king is insane to capture with, but if the knight captures, then there is mate, and if the queen captures, then the rook is hanging. So basically, white can't recapture. And that already looks like a disaster, but it turns out that white can actually play short castle, give up the knight. Bishop takes c3, takes, queen takes, and now the point is queen d6. And it's very hard to understand at first, but it turns out that white has quite decent compensation for the piece, actually. It's very, very concrete. If we had two moves and got our king to safety, it would be just winning, but it's not so easy to do, and also knight g5 and rook a d1 is coming, so we should still be accurate here. The most accurate move is queen takes c2. Now, of course, queen takes c5, we are still a piece up, so it doesn't really make too much sense. So knight g5 check is better, king e8, rook a d8. It's still a little bit surprising, but white has some compensation for the piece here, but not quite enough. So bishop d7 preventing the mate on d8, queen takes c5, and now very nicely we retreat our queen to f5. And well, it's not over. White still has some counterplay, but it's a full piece, and white definitely does not have enough for it, even though we should still be careful. So surprisingly, after bishop c2, queen f6, white is already obliged to sacrifice a piece for highly dubious compensation. For this reason, bishop e2 is objectively better, but it allows another very nice tactical idea, actually. And that tactical idea is knight takes f2. Another typical shot. And the point is, after king takes f2, bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, there is knight e4 check, forking the king and the bishop. After, let's say, king e1, knight takes c3, the material balance is equal, but both sides, king's positions, I should say, are slightly vulnerable. But on the other hand, we have slightly the better structure. So again, it's not enough, I think, for us to claim an advantage here, but it's also clearly, it's clear that we have no issues whatsoever. So the queens will likely be traded off, after which the vulnerability of the king does not matter much. And we can even try to bring it back to g8 if there is need for it. So just an important tactical idea. And this is basically explains why we are able to sacrifice the f7 pawn like this. It's a very tactical sacrifice. But after the move knight g4, there is actually an engine move that we should consider very carefully. And that is the move knight e4. And this is one of the best ways, actually, for white, I think, in the entire line after d takes c4, the entire chapter. But it's also something that is very, very hard for white to come up with, I think, over the board. Because the pawn on e5 is given back, white will also have to move their king, and it doesn't look very trustworthy at first, but it turns out that white is actually doing okay here. So knight e4, well, we take on e5 first, important not to take on d2. And now, well, one point, of course, is that the white can't take on b4 because knight takes d3 forks the king and the bishop. So what white needs to do is to retreat the bishop to e2. And this is, I think, actually the reason why it feels unattractive for white, the move knight e4, even though it's the best move according to the engines. Because you would really want to make something active happen, and simply retreating to e2, it's hard to immediately appreciate why it makes sense for white. But the point is that how to explain this in a good way? Well, the point is that either we have to trade the bishops, or the bishop will come very actively on c3. Also, our stability, I mean, we don't have a lot of stability in the center. So knight takes e5 followed by f4 is still very much on the agenda. And on the queen side, we still have this sort of slightly backward pawn on b7. So it does make some sense for white. So bishop takes d2, queen takes d2. Now, we might as well take on f3. Because anyway, white was intending to take on e5, so the trade of knights would anyway happen. And here we are able to sort of force white's hand as to how they want to recapture. If white takes with a bishop, that's actually, I mean, it's of course much more natural. At least that's my opinion. But it's actually less critical, because now after queen takes d2, king takes d2, there is a very nice move that you can play in order to solidify the queen side entirely. What you should do here is actually to play king to d8. Looks strange, but the point is that the king is fantastically placed on c7, guarding the pawn, guarding against knight d6. And after the king is on c7, then we are able to develop the bishop on c8 and the rook on a8, and we have no problems. But without the king on c7, the whole queenside situation would be a little bit vulnerable. So very important idea to keep in mind. Actually, as I mentioned, the more critical way for white here is the move g takes f3. And it's simply about kicking the knight from g4 back as quickly as possible, thereby gaining some important time. And the double pawn is not really a weakness, because, well, it's a weakness perhaps, but it's compensated very well by the fact that the g file is open, and also that f4 can be played against a potential knight on e5. And also the bishop on e2 is probably slightly better than on f3 because it keeps and the c4 pawn still guarded. So it's a mix of time and open files that white is getting for the double pawns. Queen takes d2, king takes d2. And here, another very important strategic move or strategic decision that we need to make. And that is to play the surprising move knight f6. And the reason is simply that if we play knight e5 instead, white's knight is simply much better than our knight. And our knight will even get further pushed back with f4, whereas white's knights will have this very nice d6 square available later on. So white's knight simply better, and that's why we traded with knight f6. And well, if white takes on f6, then also we get rid of our weakness on g7, so white's open g file will matter less. And in a structure like this, I mean, it might sound odd at first, but I believe that the double f-pawns are actually quite useful because they will help fight against white's majority. It's harder to push them when against the double f-pawns, and the g7 pawn is not hanging. And in general, such isolated double pawns, they are very vulnerable if, for instance, white could establish a knight in front of them. But here, with only bishops left on the board, that's not going to happen. And that makes it very, very hard for white to utilize it. So basically, it doesn't really matter much with only bishops on the board. One final point to mention is after a4, we do definitely want to play a5 in order to fix this pawn on a light square. It's, I mean, it's a bit optimistic to dream a bit about it already, but the bishop on c8 might one day end up capturing the pawn on a4. Not impossible. Also, we have some other ideas. For instance, later on, if we have our king on c7, it could also come up via b6, c5 to b4. So definitely try to fix the pawn on a light square. So next up, we develop the bishop, probably place our king on c7 again. Bring the rooks to the g file and the d file. If possible, trade the rooks, and we are doing fine. But this is sort of the worst that can happen in this line, and this is why the engine is offering it for white. But yeah, I don't really see why it's an issue. So if we go back, so d takes e5 is the most forcing option for white, but there are some calmer options as well, which are, I think, quite likely to be played over the board. One such option is queen c2. I would say, as white, it's quite possibly the move that I would play in a practical game if I see this position for the first time. So, well, the point of the move is, in fact, very, very straightforward. White takes control over e4, make sure that they don't lose a piece. And the queen on c2 in general, with the pawns on d4 and c4, it makes a lot of sense. The rook can come to b1 or even to d1. The d1 square is freed up. So it's a very common move in the anti-Meran, in the Meran, and also in the accelerated Meran. But here also with the specific purpose of preventing e4. So queen e7 is a nice antidote. We insist, we are still trying to win a piece. And this shows the downside for white with queen c2. Now, the bishop cannot retreat along this diagonal, so it has to retreat to e2. And this is already a bit of an achievement for us. Of course, that the bishop gets more passive. Short castle is very natural. And now, very, very important tactical trick. If e4, which might look natural to you, then white has this trick, knight takes e4. And after knight takes e4, bishop takes b4, white has won a pawn. So we need to be patient. We play rook e8 first. And here, it's important, it's important to understand this position in general, I think. One thing we could say immediately, which we have seen also in the previous chapter, the push d5 is rarely anything to worry about because we get this very nice c5 square. And here as well, taking on e5 feels very wrong for white because after knight takes e5, we have a lot of activity. We still have the c5 square, and white is really not in a position to ever think about pushing f4 and e4, which would be the main strategic idea. So white's main idea here, or main way to play, let's say, should be to keep the tension in the center and keep black guessing about the intentions. So one way to do that is h3. With the additional point to it after e4, the h2 square is available. And it's important also from the black perspective, I think, for you for your understanding here that e4, although it looks very tempting, there is often no rush with it. It's certainly part of our plan long term to play e4 and then build up this sort of slow initiative on the king side. Bishop d6, let's say, will come. Maybe this knight moves, maybe this knight comes here, even to h4. I mean, these sort of moves, sort of almost King's Indian attack style play, is part of the idea, but there is no rush. And if we do play e4 too early, then white might break with f3 and get a quite decent initiative. So instead, play bishop d6, keep the tension a bit, maybe even h6 before e4 to prevent knight g5 just in case, and see what white will do. It should not be forgotten that even e takes d4 is a decent option from time to time, which we will also see later on. It depends a little bit on what white does. For instance, if white plays a move like rook fe1, then the idea with f3 is much less scary because white moved away from the f file. So that's a good indication to play e4. But if white doesn't put the rook away from f1, then maybe we should wait a little bit more. So basically, for instance, the engine gives a4 as the top move, after which h6 makes a lot of sense, keeping the center. And after rook a b1, there is even the move bishop to c7. So you can see it's not that these moves are by any means forced. It's just this is the sort of waiting game that we are playing here. And bishop c7 has the point to later on play queen d6 after we have played e4, so that we get more pressure towards the white king. So here, probably white should create a square for the knight on f1. But now, finally, it's hard to find more improving moves. So e4, knight h2, and knight f8. Again, with the rook away from f1, f3 is much less scary. And we continue with knight g6, knight h4, and so on. I think even though the position is equal, these positions are very easily drifting completely out of hand for white. And I would certainly prefer to be black here. So h3 possible. Another move that should be mentioned is the move c5, which for me looks a bit strange, but the purpose is to prevent bishop to d6, prevent our bishop and sort of make our bishop stuck on the wrong side of the board. And without the bishop on d6, we cannot really go for the e4 attack because we really need the bishop for the attack to succeed. So instead, e takes d4 makes sense. And now we play for the square on d5. That is our main goal. And that is, of course, the downside by pushing c5. That is why I consider c5 a bit strange. Bishop takes c3, queen takes c3. Here, one small tactical trick that you should definitely be aware of, definitely don't miss. Queen takes e2 is a huge mistake because after rook e1, queen b5, white trades on e8 and plays a4. Turns out that the queen on b5 is trapped. Very strange, or a very unusual idea. I can't say I've seen it before, but definitely something to be aware of. Instead, a very nice way to play is knight e4, queen b2, then just trade. And again, don't take on e2, this time because of rook e1 and the e8 rook is hanging. But knight f8, a very nice regrouping. The point is to play bishop e6 next and bring the rook to d8. We are trying to put pressure on the d4 pawn, but if white attacks the pawn on b7, then also the rook can defend it from the 7th rank. And the reason we want our knight on f8 is simply to provide additional support for the bishop on e6. So if white tries some rook e1, bishop c4, for instance, then the knight guards the bishop and we are not getting overloaded. So very important. Important way or a nice way to get extra stability just in our position. And in general, d4 is at least as weak as b7 and our piece is at least as active as our opponent. So nothing to complain about in general. Finally, there is one more move, which is another engine favorite. I mean, as you can hear, I'm repeatedly mentioning engines suggestions here, which I tend to not do at all in most of the other chapters. And the reason is simply that there are no games. I cannot refer to any games because there are no games in this line. So I have nothing to refer to. So what I have done is, of course, played some training games, of course, but also just analyzed the position with the engine and see what plans and ideas there are. And that's why I'm in this specific chapter, actually only in this chapter, referring to the engine from time to time. And one engine line is queen to b1. And this has a very concrete idea, actually. The idea is if we play in similar fashion to the previous line, queen e7, then white can now take on e5. And we cannot recapture twice because the bishop on b4 is hanging. And if we try for this other typical idea, knight g4, it does look like it's all working for black, but in fact, unfortunately, it's not. And again, due to a tactical reason. So white castles, knight takes e5, takes, and here the big tactical point for white and the big reason why queen b1 was played is the move knight d5. So hitting the queen, but on the next move taking on b4 with a very, very strong dark squared bishop and a terrible position for black. So queen b1 actually forces us to retreat immediately. And well, while the bishop is definitely belonging on this diagonal on d6 towards white's king, it's a bit of a pity that white manages to keep the bishop on d3 for a while longer. So that's the reason why I decided to make queen b1 the main line, because white is able to keep the most flexible setup. Short castle. But stylistically, in terms of plans and so on, it's still very similar to the previous line with queen c2. We are still definitely looking to play e4 one day. We are still making the same sort of slow preparatory moves. h6, rook e1, queen e7. And we still have the option of take on d4 at the right moment. So it depends a bit on how the game, on how white is playing. So again, we are actually very far already out of any known theory, but I will show a couple of lines for, let's say, more... mainly to show a couple of ideas and how the game might develop, not really because they are main lines or anything like that. So one typical move is a4. One day white wants to play a5 to fix this weakness. Our setup almost always the same, rook e8, h3, and again we play h6, preventing knight g5, which could be an idea for white in order to establish the knight on e4. Rook d1, let's say, it's very hard to predict what white will play, but let's say rook d1 makes some sense. Queen e7, now e4 is really a threat, so white should do something about it. Retreating the bishop, then we are anyway playing e4 and get this typical kingside attack. Once again, once the rook leaves, f3 is becoming much less tempting for white. So actually white should probably prevent us by playing knight e4. Knight takes e4, bishop takes e4. And here you have a choice. It's possible to play any normal move like knight f6 or something like that. But I like the move e takes d4, hitting the bishop. In order to not lose it, white should give the check first, king h8 and recapture. Here g6 would be too greedy. White would sacrifice the bishop and get a very strong attack. But actually our idea with taking on d4 and why I liked it here is the next move. Here you should play c5. And the point is similar to when we played e5 in some of the earlier situations, that we are trying to force white to give up control over the dark squares in the center. So basically we are trying to make white either take, which would lead to a pretty bad pawn structure, or if d5 we have the possibility knight e5. First of all, let's say trading the knights or activating the knight, but also if we are getting our queen to e5, then we start to get counterplay against white's king. And in general, as we have seen, either with the pawn on c5, but also with the pawn on e5, this past d5 pawn, it's very rarely a big concern for us because it's so hard for white to get it anyway further. So here it's much more important that our pieces are more active than white's counterparts. And also, we are kind of, in some sense, acting while white is stuck a bit on the queen side. Also, this bishop at some point will have to lose time. So this taking on d4 followed by c5 is another nice strategic option to keep in mind. So instead of a4, another very natural move for white is to play queen c2. Here, queen c2. Just preparing maybe rook ad1 later on. A little bit more harmonious, trying to keep the rook on f1 in order, if we play e4, to be able to break with f3. Again, the nice thing for us in this line is that we can make the same moves against everything. So rook e8, h3, h6, very typical. Of course, not at all forced, as I have mentioned many times, but interesting. Rook ad1, queen e7. So as you can see, rook e8, queen e7, h6, those are our moves in most of the cases. Here, there is one interesting idea that I would like to show, which is a little bit surprising also to me, and that is if white takes on e5, you should actually recapture with the bishop. And the reason is, if you take with the knight, then takes, bishop takes, now f4. And as usual, as I have said so many times in the Accelerated Meran already, the main strategic risk for us, or goal for white, is to get these two pawns marching. And if they start to march, we might quickly end up in deep trouble. So in order to avoid that, we actually take with the bishop. So first of all, white can play f4 with the knight on f3. And if white tries to do the same, then if f4, the knight bishop on d3 is hanging. After which we will also control the e4 square and its strategic disaster for white. And if white moves, then we are just in time to play b5. Now f4 can be met by knight takes c4. So very important to keep in mind this idea of pushing f4 and e4 for white. It's really the main thing that we should that you should worry about as black. So this was a rather surprising way to meet it, but in this specific position, it works very well to take with the bishop. So finally, another option for white, which is very, very natural, which is also seen a lot in the normal Meran or anti-Meran, is the move knight to h4 in order to play knight f5. The typical reaction for black is to play knight f8. If knight f5, the bishop simply takes. Yes, white wins the bishop pair, but we get plenty of counterplay. Both e takes d4 and e4 are interesting thereafter, and the bishop on f5 might be a bit misplaced. So the critical way for white actually is to play d takes e5, just in time before we push e4. Queen takes e5, f4. Again, once white starts to push the f and e pawns, we have to be very, very careful. We have to make sure that we know exactly what we are doing. Now we play queen e7. Here e4 is very scary because we have ideas like bishop c5 followed by knight g4, discovered attack against the h4 knight. So white needs to prepare it with knight f3 first. And here, if it's white to play, they play e4 with strong initiative. So it's very, very important that we keep preventing it. And the way to do it in this situation is to play knight e6. So if e4, the f4 pawn is hanging, and if not e4, then our knight is coming to c5, after which e4 is prevented, because it would simply be hanging, as well as the bishop on d3. So probably white should try to prevent our knight getting to c5, but we insist. And after the trade, e4 still not possible because the king is in the way. And if white tries to move it, white is slowly getting ready for e4 finally. But now we have another way to get counterplay, and that is to push b5. So if e4, the c4 pawn is hanging, and if not, we play bishop e6 and start to put pressure, even more pressure against the c4 pawn. And it's all, let's say, a way to make it harder for white to push e4, because there will be this counterplay against c4. So if the pawn was back on f2, and white was not really going for that central pawn push, then we wouldn't want to play b5 because it would mainly create weaknesses. But here we simply need the counterplay, and we should also not be strategically worried because the e3 pawn will always be the main weakness. It will always be weaker than the pawn on c6 here. So now it's all about preventing e4. So b5 is a nice way to get counterplay. And this, I think, concludes the theoretical discussion of 8d takes c4. Just to quickly rehearse or mention the most important things. In this structure, play h6 or rook e8 first, h6, queen e7 is our typical setup. e4 will be played one day later on. It's our main plan. And if white at some point ever takes on e5, we should make sure that the f and e pawns are not rolling. We have a couple of different ways. Here, for instance, if white takes on e5, we take with the bishop for only, specifically for the reason not to allow f4, e4. Very, very important. And in the beginning, we also saw what happened if white took on e5. Of course, very important to be aware of this idea, knight g4, e6, knight c5. Highly, highly surprising, but gives us a lot of concrete counterplay. And very easy for white to go wrong in the tactical battle that emerges here. So, but it's all in all, I mean, it's very fresh. It's a very, very fresh territory. Very few games, very hard to predict how white will react, but I believe it's highly interesting for black, and I would certainly look forward to play it a bit more. So that concludes the theoretical lines of the chapter, and to finish off, I wanted to show you once again a couple of the most important ideas, a couple of the bullet points. And well, we started by taking on c4, b takes c4, play e5, and here I would say the two most important things is, first of all, if white were to take the pawn on e5, as we saw, we do play knight g4, and winning back the pawn on e5 will mean that we are doing very well strategically. The pawn on c4 is weak. So really the move that we should be aware of, a reminder, the move e6, which we generally speaking don't want to take. It would ruin our pawn structure. So our reply was to move knight to c5, which is very, very good. After e takes f7, king takes f7, it looks like we have lost the pawn, but we have all these tactical ideas. If bishop c2, we had queen f6 creating pressure, and if bishop e2, there was this trick with knight takes f2, king takes f2, and bishop takes c3, followed by a fork on e4. So a very, very important tactical idea, which I think is quite likely that you will face in your games. And if white didn't take on e5, played a move like queen b1, due to the fact that the bishop on b4 is hanging, we retreated the bishop to d6. And in this structure, generally speaking, our setup is, for instance, if white castles, plays a move like queen c2, we do play rook e8, we play h6, we want to put our queen on e7. At some point, we are always considering to play e4, especially when the rook leaves the f1 square, because then white will struggle to play f3. And otherwise, we are building up slowly. The move h6 is very useful. The knight can come to f8 to free up for the bishop, maybe later on even come to g6, trying to create a kingside attack. And in some moment, depending on the circumstances, we could even consider just taking on d4 to liquidate the game a little bit. But in general, we are playing on the king side, and I believe it leads to a very, very interesting fight. So this concludes this chapter on the more interesting and provocative option. I hope you have enjoyed. I hope you look forward to trying it out in your practical games. And I am looking forward to see you in the next video. Thank you very much.